The day my daughter put the hammer down on my beach house auction was the day I finally felt invisible, not just a mother, but a piece of furniture she wanted discarded. I sat in the crowded room at Sotheby's in Manhattan, heart drumming against the harsh fluorescent lights, as the gavel sealed my loss. The woman I had raised, nurtured, and sacrificed everything for had just sold my sanctuary to the highest bidder without even looking my way. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Each morning in my tiny Chelsea apartment, I woke up to the buzz of honking taxis and the faint sea salt memory drifting from my locked-away dreams of that home in the Hamptons. The smell of ocean breeze was replaced by stale pavement and cold air conditioning that never quite warmed the emptiness inside me. I pressed my shaking hands against the grimy window, imagining the sand slipping through my fingers like time itself, like the years I had poured into that house, into my children, into a life that suddenly felt like it had been built on quicksand. The phone buzzed. A message from Meredith, auction confirmed. You'll receive proceeds next week. No, Mama, or I'm sorry this had to happen. Just a sterile sentence from my daughter, delivered like a business transaction. I stared at those words until they blurred, remembering the days when she would run to me with scraped knees, when my kisses could heal anything, when my arms were her safe harbor. I remembered the days of laughter on that wraparound porch, the gentle creak of wicker rocking chairs I had carefully selected from an antique shop in East Hampton, my favorite sun hat, the one with tiny embroidered daisies, fluttering in the salty breeze. The sound of waves lapping against the private dock where we had spent countless summers, where I had taught Meredith and her brother Ethan to fish, where we had watched 4th of July fireworks paint the sky in brilliant colors. They were distant echoes now, growing fainter with each passing day like a radio signal fading as you drive away from the station. That apartment in Chelsea, all I could afford after the separation, felt like a shoebox compared to the sprawling beach house that had been my pride and joy for 23 years. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door arguing with her son about money, her voice carrying the same desperate edge I recognized in my own conversations with my children. The radiator clanked like an old ghost, reminding me that winter was coming and I would spend it alone, again, counting pennies and wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The beach house hadn't just been a house. It had been my masterpiece, my love letter to family, the place where I had imagined my grandchildren would someday build sandcastles and collect seashells. I had bought it in 1998 with the insurance money from my mother's death, back when Meredith was still in high school and Ethan was starting college. Back when they still called me Mom instead of avoiding my calls altogether. For decades, I poured every cent into that place. Not just money, but my very soul. I spent countless weekends driving out from Manhattan in my old Honda, the trunk loaded with supplies from Home Depot. I learned to fix leaking pipes from YouTube videos, my arthritic hands struggling with wrenches that seemed designed for someone half my age. I planted hydrangeas along the front path, their blue blooms matching the color of the sea on perfect August afternoons. I painted shutters, replaced broken floorboards, and spent hours on my hands and knees scrubbing salt stains from the deck furniture. Every Memorial Day weekend, I would open the house for the season, airing out the musty winter smell, washing windows until they sparkled, arranging fresh flowers in the vases I had collected over the years. I cooked elaborate meals on the old Viking stove I had saved months to afford, lobster rolls, corn on the cob, and my famous blueberry pie that the whole family claimed they loved. I took the long, exhausting subway rides back from Long Island, sometimes not getting home until midnight, just to make sure the lawn was mowed perfectly before the summer parties that filled the house with laughter and made all the hard work worthwhile. Or so I thought. When Meredith graduated from Parsons with her design degree, she came to me with dreams sparkling in her eyes. She wanted to open a boutique in Dumbo, selling handmade jewelry and vintage clothing. "It's my calling, Mom," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table of the beach house, her hands sketching out floor plans on napkins. "I just need a small loan to get started. I'll pay you back with interest, I promise." I gave her every penny I had saved for my own future, $37,000 that was supposed to be my retirement cushion, my safety net for the years when my body would no longer allow me to work as a physical therapist. No questions asked, no contracts signed, only hope blooming in my chest like those hydrangeas I tended so carefully. I believed in her vision, in her talent, in the bond between mother and daughter that I thought was unbreakable. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Ethan had asked when I told him about the loan. He was visiting for the weekend, his expensive suit looking oddly formal against the casual beach house atmosphere. Meredith's track record with money isn't exactly stellar. "She's my daughter," I replied, defensive. "She needs support, not skepticism." He shrugged, that gesture I had come to recognize as his way of washing his hands of family drama. It's your money. But it wasn't just my money. It was my trust, my faith, my maternal instinct to protect and provide. It was the culmination of years of scrimping and saving, of choosing generic groceries over name brands, of wearing the same winter coat for 5 years because every dollar I could spare went toward making the beach house perfect for my family. The boutique never opened. At least, not the way Meredith had described. 6 months after I gave her the money, I drove past the address she had given me in Brooklyn. The storefront was occupied by a cell phone repair shop, the windows covered with advertisements for screen replacements and unlock services. When I called her, she explained that the original space had fallen through, that she was looking for something better, that the money was tied up in inventory and deposits she couldn't recover. These things take time, Mom, she said, her voice already carrying that edge of impatience I would come to know so well. You wouldn't understand. You've never run a business. More months passed. The boutique became a consulting business, then an online store, then a series of vague references to projects and opportunities that never quite materialized into anything concrete. My $37,000 had vanished like morning mist over the ocean, leaving behind only a growing distance between us and a bitter taste in my mouth that I tried desperately to ignore. I should have seen the signs then. The way Meredith's visits to the beach house became shorter and more infrequent. The way she spent most of her time on her phone, even during family dinners, tapping out messages to people who seemed more important than the woman who had given her life. The way she looked at me sometimes, like I was an obligation rather than her mother, a burden she had to manage rather than a person she loved. But I kept hoping. I kept cooking her favorite meals, making up the guest room with the floral bedding she had picked out in high school, keeping fresh towels in the bathroom and her preferred brand of shampoo in the shower. I convinced myself that the distance was temporary, that once her business took off, once she found her footing in the adult world, we would be close again. I told myself that love was patient, that mothers were supposed to give without expecting anything in return. One evening, as summer was fading into autumn, I called her house in Park Slope. I had been trying to reach her for days, wanting to discuss plans for Thanksgiving. The beach house was perfect for holidays, with its large dining room and the stone fireplace that cast such a warm glow over family gatherings. Meredith, honey, are you coming for dinner this Sunday? I asked when she finally picked up, her voice sounding distracted and slightly annoyed. Her eyes must have rolled, though I couldn't see it through the phone. I could hear it in her tone. Mom, I have meetings all week. You wouldn't understand. My life isn't as simple as yours. The word stung, but I pushed down the hurt. Of course, sweetheart. I just thought, I have to go, she cut me off. I'll call you later. She didn't call later. She didn't call for 3 weeks. But late one night, as I was locking up the beach house for another lonely weekend, I heard voices drifting from the deck. Meredith and Ethan were sitting in the Adirondack chairs I had refinished myself, sharing a bottle of wine under the stars. I started to join them, happy to see my children together, but something in their hushed tones made me pause in the doorway. She's draining us, Meredith was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Always calling, always wanting something. Family dinners, holiday visits, emotional support. It's exhausting. Ethan's laugh was harsh, unfamiliar. Keep her out of the loop, he agreed. The less she knows about our lives, the better. She thinks she's entitled to be part of everything just because she's our mother. The house is worth a fortune, Meredith continued, and my blood turned to ice water. She's sitting on all this equity while claiming she can't afford things. It's selfish, really. She could sell it, downsize, and actually help us build our futures instead of hoarding it for sentimental reasons. I stood frozen in the shadows, my hand gripping the doorframe until my knuckles turned white. These were my children, the babies I had nursed through fevers and nightmares, the teenagers I had supported through heartbreaks and disappointments, the adults I had believed would always love me unconditionally. And they were talking about me like I was a burden to be managed, an obstacle to their happiness, a resource to be exploited. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom, the same room where I had dreamed of raising my own family, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The sound of waves that usually comforted me seemed mournful, like a funeral song for the relationship I thought I had with my children. I wondered if my generosity had been just a leash, binding me to people who saw me only as a means to an end. I wondered if love meant anything when it flowed in only one direction. The signs multiplied after that. Birthdays passed with empty chairs around my carefully set dining room table. I would spend days preparing elaborate meals, setting the table with the good china, arranging flowers from the garden, only to receive last-minute texts claiming work emergencies or previous commitments. The birthday cards, when they came at all, were generic ones clearly purchased at the last minute from a drugstore rack, signed with a quick scrawl and no personal message. Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you're well. Love, Meredith. As if I were an acquaintance rather than the woman who had given her $37,000 and 23 years of my life devoted to making her happy. The winter I turned 67 was brutal. Not just the weather, though the nor'easters that battered Long Island seemed particularly fierce that year. But the cold that had settled into my relationship with my children felt even more bitter than the wind howling off the Atlantic. I had slipped on a patch of black ice outside the grocery store in East Hampton, my wrist snapping with a sound I still hear in my nightmares. The pain was excruciating, but not as excruciating as lying there in the parking lot, surrounded by scattered apples from my overturned grocery bag, knowing that no one would even notice I was gone. Mrs. Chen from the hardware store helped me to her car and drove me to Southampton Hospital, where I spent 6 hours in the emergency room waiting for someone to set my broken wrist. The nurses were kind but overworked, and I sat there in my thin hospital gown, shivering and alone, staring at my phone and wondering if I should call Meredith or Ethan. In the end, I didn't. I knew they would come if I asked, but they would come with resentment, with inconvenience written on their faces, with the attitude that I had somehow broken my wrist on purpose to disrupt their busy lives. I took a taxi home, my wrist in a bright blue cast that made simple tasks like opening jars or buttoning shirts nearly impossible. The house felt cavernous around me, every room echoing with memories of happier times. I called Meredith that evening, thinking surely she would want to know about my accident, hoping she might offer to come help me adjust to life with a broken wrist. She didn't even call back. She sent a text, "Sorry to hear about your wrist. Hope you're better soon. I'll try to visit when things calm down at work." That was it. No offer to help with groceries or household tasks I couldn't manage one-handed. No suggestion that she could stay for a weekend to make sure I was managing okay. Just a polite, distant message that might have been sent to anyone, a colleague, an acquaintance, a stranger she felt obligated to acknowledge. Ethan's response was even briefer, "Get well soon." I spent that winter learning to do everything with my non-dominant hand. Brushing my teeth, making coffee, folding laundry, all the simple tasks that make up a life became monumental challenges. I hired a local teenager to help with heavy lifting and grocery shopping, paying him from my dwindling savings account while my children lived their busy, successful lives in the city, probably forgetting that I existed except when they needed something. The breaking point came in April, when the spring sunshine was just beginning to warm the house and I was planning to open it for another season. I was going through my email, deleting the usual spam about Medicare supplements and cruise ship deals, when I saw a message that made my heart stop. It was from Harrison Coastal Properties, a high-end real estate agency in East Hampton, and it was addressed to Meredith, not me. But somehow it had been forwarded to my email address, probably a mistake on someone's part, a careless click that revealed a truth I was never supposed to see. The subject line read, "Final pricing strategy for Hampton property sale." With trembling fingers and a growing sense of dread, I opened the message. What I read made me question everything I thought I knew about my daughter and our relationship. Dear MS. Meredith, thank you for the preliminary walkthrough of your mother's beach property. As discussed, we recommend listing the property at $2.8 million for a quick sale, approximately 60% of current market value. This aggressive pricing will ensure a fast transaction and minimize the emotional complications you mentioned. We have several cash buyers in our network who are looking for properties exactly like this one, and at this price point, we anticipate multiple offers within the first week. Please confirm your legal authority to proceed with the sale, and we can begin the marketing process immediately. Best regards, Patricia Harrison, Senior Real Estate Agent. I read the email 3 times before the full impact hit me. My daughter was planning to sell my house. Not just planning, she was already in active negotiations with real estate agents, discussing pricing strategies and cash buyers as if the 23 years of my life I had poured into that property meant nothing. And the price, $2.8 million when the house was easily worth $4.5 million in the current market. She was planning to sell my sanctuary, my life's work, my only substantial asset, for far less than it was worth, just to make the transaction quick and easy. But what devastated me even more than the betrayal was the phrase, "minimize the emotional complications you mentioned." As if my attachment to the house that held decades of memories was just an inconvenience to be managed. As if my feelings were obstacles to be navigated rather than emotions deserving of respect and consideration. I sat there at my kitchen table, staring at the screen until the words blurred together, and I felt something break inside me that was deeper than any bone, more fundamental than any physical injury. It was the sound of trust shattering, of love being revealed as something much more conditional and calculating than I had ever imagined. My first instinct was to call Meredith immediately, to demand an explanation, to fight for what was rightfully mine. But instead, I closed the laptop and walked out to the deck where we had shared so many family meals, where I had watched my children grow up, where I had believed we had built something lasting and meaningful together. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, indifferent to human heartbreak, and I realized that I had been living in a fantasy. For years, maybe decades, I had been pouring my love into a relationship that existed primarily in my imagination. I had been the devoted mother to children who saw me as a resource to be managed, not a person to be cherished. I went back inside and picked up my favorite teacup, a delicate porcelain piece with tiny pink roses that my own mother had given me years ago. It had survived moves and dishwashers and countless quiet mornings, but as I carried it to the sink with shaking hands, it slipped from my grip and shattered against the ceramic basin. The sound was sharp and final, and as I stared at the broken pieces scattered across the white porcelain, I began to cry. Not the dignified, quiet tears of grief, but the harsh, broken sobs of someone whose entire understanding of their life had just been turned upside down. I cried for the money I had given Meredith, for the birthdays spent alone, for the broken wrists that had gone unacknowledged, for the years of sacrifice that had apparently been taken for granted. I cried for the mother I had tried to be and the daughter I thought I had raised. But most of all, I cried for the realization that my generosity had not been appreciated, it had been exploited. My love had not been reciprocated, it had been managed. My sacrifices had not brought my family closer together, they had trained my children to see me as an ATM that occasionally required emotional maintenance. When the tears finally stopped, I sat in the gathering darkness of my kitchen and felt something new stirring in my chest. Not the familiar ache of loneliness or the sharp pain of betrayal, but something harder, more determined. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I heard my own voice whispering clearly in the silence of my heart, say no. But even as that rebellious thought took root, the fear that had governed so much of my life rushed in to smother it. What if saying no meant losing them completely? What if standing up for myself meant spending the rest of my life truly alone? What if my children's love, conditional as it apparently was better than no love at all? I gathered the pieces of the broken teacup, wrapping them carefully in paper towels as if they could somehow be repaired, as if the damage could be undone. Then I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and pulled out the photo albums I had so carefully maintained over the years. Page after page of family memories, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, summer barbecues on the deck of the beach house. In every picture, I was there, usually in the background, often holding a camera or serving food or cleaning up after everyone else. The visual evidence of a life devoted to other people's happiness, of a woman who had made herself invisible in service to her family. I closed the albums and put them away in the drawer of my nightstand, next to the spare reading glasses and the bottle of melatonin I sometimes needed to quiet my anxious thoughts. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror across the room, a 67-year-old woman with gray hair that needed coloring and lines around her eyes that spoke of years of worry and sacrifice. "What are you going to do?" I asked my reflection, but she just stared back at me with the same uncertainty and pain. The answer would have to wait until morning. That night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply, as if my body knew that something was about to change and was gathering strength for the battle ahead. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. 3 days after discovering the email, my phone rang while I was drinking my morning coffee on the deck, watching the seagulls wheel over the waves. Meredith's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I considered not answering. But curiosity, or maybe hope, made me pick up. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope you're doing well. I wanted to talk to you about something important." My hand tightened around the phone. "What's that, sweetheart?" "Well, Ethan and I have been talking, and we're worried about you living alone in that big house. It's a lot of responsibility, and you're not getting any younger. We think it might be time to consider downsizing." The word hung between us like a weapon. Downsizing. Such a corporate term for dismantling a life. Downsizing, I repeated, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "I know it might seem overwhelming," she continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I had learned to recognize as her way of managing difficult conversations. "But think about it practically. You'd have so much less to worry about, no more property taxes or maintenance issues. You could get a nice little condo somewhere, maybe closer to the city so we could see you more often." The lie in that last sentence was so transparent it was almost insulting. They weren't planning to see me more often. They were planning to have easier access to whatever money was left after the house sale. And what would happen to the house? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Well, obviously it would need to be sold. But don't worry, Ethan and I would handle everything. We know how hard these things are for you to deal with. We'd take care of all the paperwork and negotiations. You wouldn't have to worry about any of the details. There it was. The plan laid out in careful, reasonable language that disguised its essential cruelty. They would take care of selling my house at below market value, probably keeping the difference for themselves while convincing me it was for my own good. They would handle everything while excluding me from decisions about my own property. They would minimize the emotional complications by treating my feelings as obstacles to be overcome rather than valid concerns to be addressed. I need to think about it, I said finally. Of course, Meredith replied, and I could hear the relief in her voice. She had expected more resistance. Take all the time you need. But don't wait too long, the real estate market is really hot right now, and we want to make sure you get the best possible price. Another lie. They had already decided on a price that was far below market value. They had already chosen speed and convenience over maximizing my return on 23 years of investment and love. After we hung up, I sat for a long time watching the waves roll onto the private beach that came with the property. I thought about all the summer days I had spent on that sand, building castles with my children when they were small, teaching them to body surf in the gentle breakers, reading books under the striped umbrella I had bought from a vendor in Montauk. I thought about the 4th of July parties, the barbecues, the quiet evenings when the whole family would gather on the deck to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. All of those memories, all of that history, reduced to a real estate transaction that needed to be handled quickly and efficiently. But what hurt even more than the betrayal was the realization of how skillfully I was being manipulated. The concern for my well-being, the offer to handle all the details, the suggestion that seeing them more often was even a possibility, it was all carefully crafted to make me feel like the sale was my idea, my choice, my benefit. They were trying to convince me to collaborate in my own exploitation. I spent the rest of that day walking through every room of the house, touching the walls I had painted, the fixtures I had chosen, the furniture I had arranged and rearranged over the years. In the living room, the built-in bookcases I had filled with family photos and souvenirs from vacations and holidays. In the kitchen, the window over the sink where I had watched countless sunrises while making coffee for my family. In the master bedroom, the cedar chest at the foot of the bed where I kept extra blankets and, in the very bottom, the christening gowns my children had worn as babies. Every corner of the house held memories, but more than that, it held the evidence of my life's work. This wasn't just a property to be liquidated, it was the physical manifestation of everything I had worked for, saved for, and sacrificed for. It was proof that my life had meant something, that I had built something lasting and beautiful. And my children wanted to sell it for quick cash, without even including me in the decision-making process. That evening, I called my neighbor Carla, who lived year-round in the small cottage next door. Carla was a widow about my age who had moved out from Queens after her husband died, seeking the peace and quiet of the seaside community. We had become friendly over the years, sharing vegetables from our gardens and the occasional cup of coffee when we happened to be working in our yards at the same time. "I hope I'm not bothering you," I said when she answered the phone. "But I was wondering if you might have time for a cup of tea. I'm having a difficult time, and I could use a friendly ear." "Of course, honey," she said immediately. "Come on over. I just made a pot of chamomile." Carla's cottage was small but warm, filled with the kind of comfortable furniture that invited long conversations. We sat in her living room, two widows in their 60s, both of us probably invisible to the younger world but finding solace in each other's company. I told her everything. The loan that was never repaid, the broken wrist that barely earned a text message, the overheard conversation about keeping me out of the loop, and finally, the email about selling the house. By the time I finished, Carla's kind face was set in hard lines of anger. "Those ungrateful little..." She started, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. They're your children, and I know you love them. But honey, what they're doing to you isn't love. It's abuse." The word hit me like a physical blow. Abuse. I had never thought of it that way. Abuse was what happened to other people, in other families. It was violent and dramatic and obvious. It wasn't the slow erosion of respect, the casual exploitation of generosity, the systematic dismissal of a mother's feelings and needs. "They don't hit me," I protested weakly. "They're not cruel. They're just busy. Focused on their careers. I don't think they mean to hurt me." Carla reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were warm and calloused from her garden work, and the simple human contact made me want to cry again. "Sweetie," she said gently, "emotional abuse is still abuse. Financial exploitation is still abuse. Taking advantage of someone's love and generosity until there's nothing left, that's abuse. And the fact that they're doing it with a smile and a justification doesn't make it any less harmful. We sat in silence for a while, sipping tea and listening to the distant sound of waves. Finally, Carla spoke again. "What do you want to do?" It was such a simple question, but it was the first time in years that anyone had asked me what I wanted. Not what was practical, not what was best for everyone else, not what would cause the least disruption to other people's lives. What did I want? "I want to keep my house," I said quietly. "I want my children to respect me enough to include me in decisions about my own life. I want them to love me for who I am, not for what I can give them." I paused, then added with growing strength, "And I want to stop being afraid of their anger." Carla smiled. "Then that's what we'll work toward." The next morning, I began the process of taking back control of my life. My first stop was the office of Margaret Steinberg, an attorney in Southampton who specialized in elder law and estate planning. I had found her name online, and her reviews spoke of someone who was tough but compassionate, experienced in dealing with families where money and emotions created complicated dynamics. Margaret's office was in a converted Victorian house near the train station, all polished wood and tasteful nautical prints. She was a woman in her 50s with short silver hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had seen everything and wasn't easily shocked. I told her my story, walking through the same details I had shared with Carla but feeling stronger this time, more focused. Margaret took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just listening with the intense attention of someone who understood the legal implications of every detail. "Let me make sure I understand," she said when I finished. "Your daughter has been in contact with real estate agents about selling your property without your knowledge or consent. She has discussed pricing strategies that would significantly undervalue the property. And she's now pressuring you to agree to a sale that would benefit her financially while leaving you with substantially less than the property is worth." "Yes," I said, and hearing it summarized so clearly made the situation seem even more outrageous. "And you want to maintain ownership of the property while protecting yourself from future manipulation or coercion?" "Yes. But I also don't want to lose my relationship with my children entirely. They're all the family I have left." Margaret leaned back in her chair and studied me for a moment. "Mrs. Coleman, I've been practicing law for 25 years, and I've seen a lot of families destroy themselves over money and property. But I've also seen people find ways to set healthy boundaries while preserving the relationships that matter to them. The key is being clear about what you will and won't accept, and having the legal structure in place to enforce those boundaries." Over the next hour, we discussed my options. I could file a restraining order preventing any sale of the property without my explicit consent. I could revoke any power of attorney documents that might give my children legal authority over my affairs. I could change my will and estate planning to reflect my current feelings about how my assets should be distributed. But most importantly, Margaret explained, I could take concrete steps to protect my financial independence while making it clear to my children that their behavior needed to change if they wanted to remain part of my life. "The strongest position you can negotiate from," she said, "is a position of genuine independence. If you're not afraid of losing their approval because you don't need their approval to survive and thrive, then you can have honest conversations about what kind of relationship you actually want to have with them." I left her office with a folder full of documents to review and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since discovering Meredith's secret plans, I felt like I was taking action rather than just reacting to other people's decisions about my life. That afternoon, I drove to the bank in East Hampton where I had maintained accounts for over 20 years. I met with the branch manager, a kind woman named Susan who had helped me with various financial matters over the years, and explained that I needed to review and possibly change the access permissions on all my accounts. It turned out that, at some point over the years, probably when I was dealing with my late husband's final illness, I had added Meredith as an authorized user on several accounts. She could see my balances, my transaction history, even make withdrawals if she chose to. She had been monitoring my finances for years, tracking my spending and savings as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted to manage my own money. "I want her removed from all accounts immediately," I told Susan. "And I want to be notified of any attempts to access information about my finances." Susan nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry to say, but we see this more often than you might think. Well-meaning family members who gradually take more and more control over their parents' financial lives, sometimes with good intentions, sometimes not." Within an hour, I had regained complete control over my own money for the first time in years. I also opened a new savings account at a different bank, one where none of my family members were known, and transferred a substantial portion of my assets there as a security measure. As I drove home along the familiar roads of the East End, past the farm stands and the small businesses that had become part of my extended community over the years, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I had almost forgotten what it was like: power. Not power over other people, but power over my own life. The ability to make decisions based on my own needs and desires rather than on fear of other people's reactions. But that feeling of empowerment was tested almost immediately. When I got home, there was a message from Meredith on my answering machine. "Hi Mom, it's me. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the house. I've gotten some preliminary estimates from a few realtors, and the numbers are looking really good. I think we should move forward as soon as possible. Can you call me back tonight? I have some paperwork for you to sign." The casual assumption that I had already agreed to the sale was breathtaking in its arrogance. She was moving forward with plans to sell my house based on a conversation where I had explicitly said I needed time to think. She had paperwork for me to sign, as if my signature were just a formality, a rubber stamp on decisions that had already been made. I didn't call her back that night. Or the next night. For the first time in my adult life as a mother, I let my daughter's calls go unanswered, not because I was busy or unavailable, but because I was choosing not to engage with her attempts to manipulate me. The silence didn't last long. By the third day, both Meredith and Ethan were calling repeatedly. Their messages evolved from concerned to annoyed to finally frantic. "Mom, are you okay? I'm starting to worry about you. Please call me back. Mom, this is ridiculous. I know you're there. Pick up the phone. Mom, if you don't call me back by tonight, I'm driving out there to check on you." That last message, from Ethan, carried a threatening undertone that I might not have noticed before my conversations with Carla and Margaret. The implication was clear: if I didn't respond to their attempts to control the situation, they would escalate to more direct intervention. They would show up at my house, probably with concerned expressions and reasonable explanations, and pressure me face to face to sign whatever documents they had prepared. Instead of being intimidated, I felt that new strength rising in me again. I was done being managed. I was done having my emotions and decisions treated as obstacles to be overcome. I was done being afraid of my own children's disapproval. I called Meredith back on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew she would be at her boutique, the one that had finally opened, 2 years late and in a much smaller space than originally planned, funded not just by my $37,000 but by money she had borrowed from Ethan and, I suspected, from her father. "Mom," she said when she answered, her voice carrying relief and frustration in equal measure. "Where have you been?" "I've been worried sick. I've been thinking," I said calmly, "about our conversation regarding the house." "Good," she said, and I could hear the rustle of papers in the background. "I have all the documents ready. When can you come into the city to sign them, or should I drive out there?" "Neither," I said. "I've decided not to sell the house." The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Meredith spoke, her voice carefully controlled but with an edge that made me straighten my shoulders. "Mom, I think maybe you don't understand the full situation. The house is a huge burden for you. You can't possibly maintain it properly on your own, and it's not fair to expect Ethan and me to constantly worry about you living alone in such an isolated location." "I'm not asking you to worry about me," I replied. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself and my property." "But the financial advantages of selling now, Meredith," I interrupted, my voice growing firmer. "The house is not for sale. Not now, not next month, not next year. It's my house, it's my decision, and the discussion is closed." Another long pause. When she spoke again, the careful modulation was gone from her voice, replaced by the kind of cold anger I had only heard her use with service workers who disappointed her or ex-boyfriends who had failed to meet her expectations. "I don't think you're thinking clearly," she said. "This is exactly the kind of poor decision-making that worries us about your ability to live independently. Maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor or a doctor, about these feelings you're having." The suggestion that my refusal to go along with her plans was evidence of mental instability was so outrageous it actually made me laugh. "My thinking is perfectly clear," I said. "Clearer than it's been in years, actually." "We'll see about that," she said, and hung up. I sat holding the phone for several minutes after the dial tone started, processing what had just happened. My daughter, the child I had raised, loved, and supported through every challenge and disappointment in her life, had just threatened me. She had implied that my refusal to surrender my property to her control was evidence of mental illness that might require professional intervention. She had suggested that my independence was negotiable, subject to her approval and oversight. And for the first time in this entire nightmare, I wasn't hurt or confused or afraid. I was angry. The phone rang again within minutes. This time, it was Ethan. "Mom, Meredith called me. She says you're acting irrationally about the house situation." "Hello to you too, Ethan," I said dryly. "Don't be sarcastic. This is serious. Do you understand the financial implications of keeping that house? The property taxes alone are more than most people pay for rent. The maintenance costs, the insurance, the utilities for a place you barely use anymore. It's financially irresponsible." "It's my money," I said. "My house. My responsibility. But it affects all of us," he said, and there it was, the truth finally spoken clearly. When you waste money on unnecessary expenses, there's less available for other things. For helping us when we need it, for emergencies, for your own future care if you get sick. Other things, I repeated. "You mean like the $37,000 I gave Meredith for her boutique? Money that was never repaid? Other things like the countless times I've sent help when you were short on rent or needed car repairs or wanted to take a vacation you couldn't afford." "That's different," he said, but his voice was less certain now. "We're family. Family helps each other." "Yes," I agreed. "Family does help each other. But help flows in both directions, Ethan. It's not just parents giving and children taking until there's nothing left." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I broke my wrist last winter and spent 6 hours alone in an emergency room because I didn't want to bother you or your sister with my problems. It means I've had birthday after birthday with no one to share them with because you're both too busy with your own lives to spend a few hours with your mother. It means I've been treated like an ATM for years, valued primarily for what I can provide rather than for who I am." The silence stretched between us. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice softer but still defensive. "It's not like that, Mom. We love you." "Maybe you do," I said. "But you don't respect me. And love without respect isn't really love at all, it's just need dressed up in prettier words." After I hung up, I walked out onto the deck and stood watching the sun set over the water, painting the sky in colors that reminded me why I had fallen in love with this place all those years ago. The house was quiet around me, but for the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful rather than lonely. I was done apologizing for taking up space in my children's lives. Done feeling guilty for having needs and feelings and opinions that didn't align perfectly with their plans. Done shrinking myself to fit into the narrow role they had assigned me, the convenient, undemanding mother who could be counted on to give without question and disappear without complaint when her usefulness ended. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. Neither Meredith nor Ethan called, and I didn't call them. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't ringing with requests for money or complaints about their various problems. I wasn't receiving long, dramatic text messages about work stress or relationship troubles, accompanied by subtle hints about bills that needed paying or expenses that were stretching their budgets thin. Instead, I had something I hadn't experienced since my children were small, peaceful, uninterrupted time to focus on my own life and interests. I started taking long walks on the beach in the early morning, before the summer tourist season brought crowds and noise to the usually serene shoreline. I rediscovered the simple pleasure of reading novels without interruption, of drinking my coffee while it was still hot, of making dinner plans based solely on what I wanted to eat rather than on accommodating other people's dietary restrictions or schedule conflicts. I also began to notice things about my life that I had been too busy and distracted to see clearly before. The house, which had felt like such a burden when I was maintaining it primarily for other people's use, became a source of genuine pleasure when I was caring for it for my own enjoyment. I painted the guest bathroom a sunny yellow color I had always loved but had never used because Meredith thought it was too bold. I planted a small herb garden outside the kitchen window, something I had wanted to do for years but hadn't because Ethan was allergic to oregano. Small changes, but each one felt like an act of reclaiming myself. Carla stopped by regularly, sometimes to share vegetables from her garden, sometimes just to sit on the deck and talk. Her friendship became an anchor in the uncertainty of my changing relationship with my own family. She listened without judgment when I questioned whether I was being too harsh, too demanding, too unreasonable in my expectations. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that wanting basic respect and consideration wasn't asking too much. "You know what I think," she said one evening as we watched the stars appear over the ocean. "I think you raised your children to believe that your love was unconditional, but you forgot to teach them that their access to your resources was conditional on treating you well." It was a simple observation, but it crystallized something I had been struggling to understand. I had confused unconditional love, which was appropriate between parent and child, with unconditional availability and support, which was not. I had taught my children that no matter how they treated me, no matter how they dismissed my feelings or exploited my generosity, my love and my resources would always be available to them. I had created a dynamic where bad behavior was not just tolerated but rewarded with continued financial and emotional support. But understanding the problem and fixing it were two very different things. I still loved my children deeply, possibly more than they deserved. I still lay awake some nights wondering if I was making a terrible mistake, if my stubbornness and pride were destroying relationships that could be repaired with a little more patience and compromise on my part. Those doubts were tested in the most painful way imaginable on a Thursday morning in late July. I was watering my herb garden when my phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged me in a post on social media, something that rarely happened, since my online presence was limited to occasional photos of sunsets and garden vegetables. The post was on Meredith's Instagram account, which I followed despite the fact that her updates usually made me feel excluded from her life rather than connected to it. But this post was different. It was a series of photos from what appeared to be a family gathering: Meredith, Ethan, and their father, along with several people I didn't recognize, all smiling and laughing around a dinner table I recognized as belonging to my ex-husband's apartment in the city. The caption read, "So grateful for family dinners and the people who love us unconditionally. Sometimes you have to protect your peace by limiting contact with toxic relationships, even when it's difficult. Choosing mental health over guilt and manipulation. Hashtag family first, hashtag boundaries, hashtag self-care." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. My daughter had posted a public declaration that I was the toxic relationship she needed to protect herself from. She had used the language of mental health and self-care, concepts I supported and understood, to justify cutting me out of her life and to make it seem like my desire for respect and inclusion was actually psychological manipulation. But what broke my heart more than the public humiliation was the evidence that they were having family dinners without me. They weren't too busy for family gatherings, they were too busy for family gatherings that included me. They were capable of making time for relationships they valued, of prioritizing people whose company they enjoyed. I simply wasn't one of those people. The comments on the post made it even worse. Friends and acquaintances who had met me at various family events over the years were liking and responding with supportive messages about the importance of cutting out negative energy and protecting your boundaries. People who had once complimented me on raising such successful, loving children were now applauding those same children for excluding me from their lives. I knew I should ignore it. I knew that responding would only escalate the situation and give Meredith more ammunition for her narrative about my emotional manipulation and inappropriate behavior. But the hurt was so sharp, so public, so deliberately designed to humiliate me, that I couldn't just let it pass. I typed and deleted a dozen responses. I wanted to defend myself, to explain my side of the story, to tell those commenters about the money I had loaned, the birthday dinners I had cooked for empty chairs, the broken wrist I had suffered alone while my children lived their busy, important lives just 2 hours away. But in the end, I didn't respond at all. Because I realized that engaging with the post would prove Meredith's point, that I was needy, demanding, unable to respect boundaries. The most powerful response was no response at all. Instead, I called Margaret, my attorney. I saw the social media post. I told her after explaining the situation. "I know it probably seems trivial compared to your other cases, but it feels like a form of harassment. She's using public platforms to humiliate me and justify her behavior." "It's not trivial at all," Margaret said firmly. Public humiliation and character assassination are serious matters, especially when they're part of a pattern of financial and emotional abuse. Have you considered that this post might be laying the groundwork for a more serious legal challenge to your autonomy? I hadn't considered that, but Margaret's question sent a chill down my spine. If Meredith and Ethan were building a public case that I was mentally unstable, emotionally manipulative, and toxic to be around, they might be preparing to challenge my competency or to seek guardianship over my affairs. The social media post wasn't just a cruel personal attack, it was potentially a legal strategy. "What can I do?" I asked. "Document everything," Margaret advised. "Screenshot that post and any comments or responses. Keep records of all communications with your children, especially any that show their financial motivations or their attempts to pressure you into decisions about your property. And consider whether you want to take more active steps to protect yourself." What kind of steps? Well, you could have your mental competency formally evaluated by a qualified professional, creating an official record that contradicts any future claims about your stability. You could also consider pursuing harassment or defamation claims, though that would likely escalate the family conflict significantly. The idea of having my sanity officially certified felt surreal, but I understood the strategic importance. If my children were going to question my mental fitness, I needed professional documentation that I was perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively checking Meredith's social media accounts, looking for additional posts or comments that might reference me or our situation. It was a toxic habit that left me feeling worse each time, but I couldn't seem to stop. The uncertainty was almost worse than the humiliation, not knowing if my private family drama was being discussed and dissected by people I barely knew, not knowing if my reputation in the community was being systematically destroyed by my own daughter. The obsessive monitoring paid off, though not in the way I had expected. 3 days after the original post, I found something that changed everything. Hidden in Ethan's much less active Instagram account was a photo posted at the same time as Meredith's family dinner pictures. It showed him standing next to an expensive-looking sports car with the caption, "New ride." Sometimes life surprises you when you least expect it. The timestamp on the photo was important, but even more important was a comment from one of his friends, "Congrats man. That commission from your mom's house sale must have been amazing." I screenshot that comment immediately, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and vindication. Ethan had referred to the potential sale of my house as his commission, as money he had already earned and was apparently spending on a new car. But I had never agreed to the sale. I had explicitly refused to sell the house, had taken legal steps to prevent any sale without my consent. Which meant that either my son was lying to his friends about a sale that hadn't happened, or he was moving forward with plans to sell my property despite my explicit refusal. I called Margaret immediately. "This changes things significantly," she said after I read her the comment. "If they're already spending money based on an anticipated sale of your property, they're either engaging in financial fraud or they have some legal authority over your assets that you're not aware of." The second possibility was terrifying. Could there be documents I had signed during my late husband's illness that gave my children more control over my finances than I realized? Could there be legal loopholes or technicalities that would allow them to override my wishes about my own property? "We need to do a comprehensive review of all your financial and legal documents," Margaret said. "I want to make sure there are no surprises, no powers of attorney or trustee arrangements that could be used against you. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the comment on Ethan's post, about the implications of my children not just wanting to sell my house but actively planning to profit from its sale. The $37,000 I had given Meredith suddenly seemed like a small loss compared to the potential theft of my most valuable asset. But even more than the financial fear, I was struggling with the emotional reality that my relationship with my children had deteriorated to the point where I needed legal protection from them. When I had first become a mother, holding those tiny, perfect babies in my arms, I had imagined a future of mutual love and support, of family bonds that would strengthen over time. I had never imagined that I would need lawyers and legal documents to protect myself from the people I had sacrificed so much to raise and nurture. The meeting with Margaret the next morning was both reassuring and disturbing. The good news was that I had maintained complete legal control over my assets. There were no hidden documents giving my children authority over my property or finances. The bad news was that their behavior suggested they believed they had such authority, which meant they were either planning to pursue legal guardianship or they were gambling that I wouldn't effectively resist their plans. "The Instagram comment about a commission is particularly concerning," Margaret said as we reviewed my files. "It suggests they may have already entered into contracts or agreements with real estate agents or buyers, possibly forging your signature or claiming to act on your behalf. Can they do that? Not legally, no. But they could create significant complications that would be expensive and time-consuming to resolve. If they've convinced buyers or agents that they have authority to sell the property, you could end up in lengthy legal battles even if you ultimately prevail." Margaret recommended that I take immediate and visible steps to establish my competency and my control over the situation. This included the mental fitness evaluation she had mentioned earlier, but also more dramatic measures designed to make it clear that I was actively protecting my interests. "I think it's time to go on the offensive," she said. "Instead of just defending against their potential moves, let's make some moves of our own that will force them to respond to you rather than the other way around." The first step was a formal cease and desist letter, sent to both Meredith and Ethan, demanding that they stop any and all activities related to the sale of my property. The letter, written in the formal language of legal threats, made it clear that any attempts to sell, mortgage, or otherwise encumber my property without my written consent would be considered fraud and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But Margaret also suggested a more personal approach that would force my children to confront the consequences of their behavior directly. "What if we arranged a family meeting?" she suggested. "Something formal, with me present as your legal representative, where you could lay out your position clearly and give them a chance to explain their actions. Sometimes people behave badly because they think there won't be any consequences. A formal confrontation can change that dynamic. The idea terrified me. I had spent so many years avoiding conflict with my children, accepting their dismissive treatment and their financial exploitation rather than risk the angry confrontations that might result from standing up for myself. But I was also exhausted from living in fear of their disapproval, tired of tiptoeing around their feelings while my own were completely ignored. "Let's do it," I said. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, in Margaret's conference room in Southampton. I spent the days leading up to it in a state of nervous energy, rehearsing what I wanted to say, imagining how my children might respond, wondering if this confrontation would repair our relationship or destroy it completely. Meredith and Ethan both initially refused to attend, claiming they were too busy and dismissing the meeting as an unnecessary legal drama created by my overreaction to normal family discussions about my future. But Margaret's assistant made it clear that their attendance was not optional. We would be discussing their potential legal liability for activities related to my property, and their presence was required to avoid more serious consequences. They arrived together on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-August, both dressed in business attire that seemed designed to emphasize their adult success and my comparative irrelevance. Meredith wore a tailored black suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year, her hair professionally styled and her makeup flawless. Ethan looked equally polished in an expensive gray suit and silk tie, his hair freshly cut and his shoes shined to a high gloss. They looked like successful, responsible adults who had their lives together. I looked like exactly what I was, a 67-year-old woman whose children had driven her to seek legal protection from their exploitation. Margaret began the meeting by outlining the purpose, to clarify everyone's understanding of my legal rights regarding my property and to address concerns about unauthorized activities related to a potential sale. "Before we discuss any specifics," she said, "I want to establish a few basic facts. Mrs. Coleman, you are the sole legal owner of the property in question, correct?" "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And you have not, at any point, given written authorization for the sale of that property?" "No, I have not." "And you have not appointed anyone as your legal representative with authority to make decisions about your real estate holdings?" "No." Margaret turned to Meredith and Ethan. "Do either of you dispute these facts?" They exchanged glances. Meredith spoke first. "We don't dispute the legal technicalities," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I had learned to dread. "But we are concerned about Mom's ability to make sound financial decisions. The property represents the majority of her assets, and she's not maintaining it properly. She's not thinking about her long-term care needs or her financial security in retirement." "Those are important considerations," Margaret agreed. "But they don't give you legal authority to make decisions on your mother's behalf without her consent." "Have either of you had any communications with real estate agents regarding this property?" Another exchange of glances. This time, Ethan answered. "We may have made some preliminary inquiries about market values, just to help Mom understand her options." "Without her knowledge or consent?" Silence. Margaret opened a file on the table. "I have copies of email communications between Meredith Coleman and Harrison Coastal Properties discussing pricing strategies for a quick sale of the property. These emails include detailed discussions of how to minimize emotional complications and references to cash buyers and fast transactions. This doesn't sound like preliminary market research, it sounds like active sale negotiations." Meredith's composed facade cracked slightly. "We were just trying to help. Mom doesn't understand the current real estate market, and we were gathering information so we could present her with realistic options. By discussing strategies to sell her property for significantly below market value. The pricing was based on the condition of the property and the need for a quick sale to avoid market fluctuations," Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret pulled out another document. "I also have evidence that you, Mr. Coleman, have made social media posts suggesting that you've already received financial benefit from the sale of your mother's property. Specifically, a comment referring to a commission from your mom's house sale in connection with the purchase of a new vehicle." The color drained from Ethan's face. He had clearly forgotten about that comment, had probably made it without thinking about how it might be interpreted or used as evidence. I was just joking around with friends," he stammered. "It didn't mean anything." "So you haven't purchased a new car with money you expect to receive from the sale of your mother's property?" No. "Maybe. I mean, I bought a car, but not with money from." He trailed off, clearly realizing that any explanation would only make things worse. Margaret let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. "Let me be very clear about the legal situation. Any attempt to sell, mortgage, or otherwise dispose of Mrs. Coleman's property without her explicit written consent would constitute fraud. Any representations to third parties that you have authority to act on her behalf could result in civil and potentially criminal liability. Any contracts or agreements you've entered into regarding this property are void and unenforceable. She paused to let that sink in before delivering the ultimatum. Mrs. Coleman is prepared to pursue legal action against anyone who attempts to interfere with her property rights, including family members. However, she's also willing to put this matter behind her if certain conditions are met. All eyes turned to me. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the speech I had rehearsed over and over in my mind. But sitting there, looking at my children's faces, angry, defensive, but also worried, I felt the familiar urge to soften my words, to minimize my own needs in order to preserve family harmony. Instead, I thought about Carla's words about unconditional love versus unconditional access to resources. I thought about the broken wrists they had barely acknowledged, the birthdays they had ignored, the years of financial support they had taken for granted. I thought about the social media post where Meredith had publicly branded me as toxic for wanting basic respect and consideration. I love you both, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I will always love you, because you're my children. But love doesn't mean accepting disrespect. It doesn't mean allowing myself to be exploited financially or emotionally. And it doesn't mean surrendering control over my life and my property to people who have shown me that they value my resources more than my feelings. Meredith started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. For years, I have given you money whenever you asked. I have supported your businesses, paid for your emergencies, covered your expenses, and never asked for anything in return except basic courtesy and respect. Instead, I've been treated like an inconvenience, like a burden you have to manage rather than a person you love. I pulled out the photo I had brought, the same one from the beach house that I had torn apart during our online family confrontation months earlier. But this wasn't the torn original. This was a copy I had made, of the two of us on the porch swing, laughing together on what had been one of the happiest days of my life as a mother. This is who we used to be, I said, holding up the photo so they could see it. This is the relationship I thought we had. But you've made it clear that this version of us, where I'm valued for who I am, not just what I can provide, doesn't exist anymore. I set the photo on the table and looked directly at each of them. So here's what's going to happen. The house is not for sale. Not now, not ever, unless I decide to sell it. Any attempts to sell it without my consent will be prosecuted as fraud. Any future requests for money will be carefully considered based on whether you've earned the privilege of my generosity through your treatment of me as a person. Meredith's mask finally fell completely. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You're being manipulative and controlling. We're trying to help you make smart financial decisions, and you're acting like we're trying to steal from you. Aren't you? I asked quietly. You are planning to sell my house for less than it's worth and keep the difference. You've been monitoring my financial accounts without my knowledge. You've publicly humiliated me on social media to justify cutting me out of family gatherings. If that's not stealing, financially and emotionally, then what is? Ethan leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone he probably used with difficult clients. Mom, you're not seeing the big picture. The house is a liability. You can't maintain it properly, you barely use it anymore, and it's tying up capital that could be invested more wisely. It's my capital, I said firmly. My house. My decision. And my right to make choices about my own life that you may not understand or approve of. But we're your family, Meredith said, her voice cracking with what might have been genuine emotion. We're supposed to take care of each other. Yes, I agreed. We are. But taking care of each other doesn't mean one person giving all the time while the other person only takes. It doesn't mean ignoring birthdays and broken bones and emotional needs because you're too busy or too important to bother with an aging mother. It doesn't mean plotting to sell someone's most precious possession for your own financial benefit. The room fell silent. Margaret shuffled through her papers, allowing the weight of my words to settle. Finally, she spoke. Mrs. Coleman has prepared a formal statement of her position regarding future family relationships. Would you like her to read it? I nodded and pulled out the letter I had written with Margaret's help. It was a document I never thought I would need to create, a formal statement of the conditions under which I was willing to maintain relationships with my own children. To my children, Meredith and Ethan, I read aloud. I love you both, but love alone is not sufficient to maintain healthy family relationships. Going forward, any relationship we have will be based on mutual respect and consideration. This means no more unilateral decisions about my property or finances. No more public humiliation or character assassination. No more treating me like an obligation rather than a person deserving of basic courtesy. I looked up at them before continuing. It also means that financial support from me is no longer guaranteed or automatic. If you need help in the future, you will need to ask respectfully and accept that the answer might be no. You will need to demonstrate that you value me as a person, not just as a resource. Meredith was crying now, but I couldn't tell if the tears were genuine grief or frustration at losing control over the situation. If you can accept these conditions, I continued reading, then we can work toward rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. If you cannot accept them, then we will have no relationship at all. The choice is yours. I folded the letter and set it on the table between us. That's my position. Take some time to think about it, and let me know what you decide. Meredith and Ethan left the meeting without saying goodbye, their faces hard with anger and hurt pride. I watched them walk to their car through Margaret's office window, wondering if I would ever see them again, wondering if I had just sacrificed my relationship with my children for the sake of my own dignity. But as I drove home to the beach house, my beach house, that I had earned and maintained and had every right to keep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace that came from finally standing up for myself, from finally refusing to accept unacceptable treatment just to avoid conflict. That night, I sat on my deck watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the same colors that had captivated me when I first fell in love with this place. The house was quiet around me, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of loneliness. It was the peaceful silence of a space that was truly mine, a sanctuary where I didn't have to apologize for existing or minimize my needs to accommodate other people's comfort. Carla stopped by later that evening with a bottle of wine and a concerned expression. "How did it go?" she asked as we settled into the Adirondack chairs I had fought so hard to keep. I told her everything, from the formal legal language to Meredith's tears to the silence that had followed my ultimatum. Carla listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "Do you think they'll come around?" she asked when I finished. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe. Maybe not. But for the first time in years, I'm okay with not knowing. I spent so much energy trying to manage their reactions, trying to avoid their anger or disappointment, that I forgot to pay attention to my own needs and feelings. Whatever happens next, at least I know I stood up for myself." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and watching the stars appear over the ocean. Finally, Carla spoke again. "You know what I admire about what you did today? You didn't just protect your property. You protected your dignity. That's worth more than any house, no matter how beautiful it is." But the confrontation wasn't the end of the story. If anything, it was the beginning of a new and more difficult phase of the family drama. Over the next few weeks, I discovered that my children's response to being challenged was not reflection or apology, but escalation. It started with phone calls to other family members, cousins, aunts and uncles, family friends, spreading their version of recent events. According to these calls, which I learned about through mutual acquaintances who felt I should know what was being said, I had become unstable and paranoid in my old age. I was making irrational financial decisions and alienating family members who were only trying to help. I had hired lawyers to prevent my own children from ensuring my welfare, and I was living alone in a house I could no longer properly maintain. The calls were apparently effective. Several people who had been friendly acquaintances for years began treating me with the careful distance reserved for someone who might be mentally fragile. Conversations became stilted and awkward, full of the kind of overly cheerful concern that suggested people weren't sure whether I was competent to manage basic social interactions. But the most devastating blow came 3 weeks after our meeting with Margaret, when I opened my local newspaper to find a feature article about elder abuse and family financial exploitation. The article was written by a journalist named Sandra Mitchell, whom I didn't know personally but who apparently knew my situation in intimate detail. The piece was ostensibly about general trends in elder abuse, but it included a detailed case study that was clearly based on my family drama. While the names were changed, anyone in our community would have recognized the specifics: a widow in her 60s living alone in a valuable beach house, estranged from her adult children over financial disagreements, possibly showing signs of cognitive decline that were affecting her decision-making abilities. The article presented my children's position sympathetically, portraying them as concerned offspring trying to protect an aging mother who had become suspicious and hostile toward family members attempting to help her. My refusal to sell the house was characterized as clinging to an unrealistic lifestyle that I could no longer afford or maintain. My legal actions were described as evidence of paranoid thinking and an inappropriate escalation of normal family disagreements. Elder abuse takes many forms, the article concluded, but one of the most heartbreaking is when seniors become so isolated and suspicious that they reject help from the people who love them most. Family members in these situations face the impossible choice between respecting their loved ones' wishes and protecting them from their own poor judgment. I read the article 3 times, each reading making me feel sicker and more humiliated. This wasn't just gossip or family drama anymore. This was a public, professional presentation of me as exactly the kind of crazy old woman Meredith had been describing in her social media posts. It was a systematic destruction of my reputation, designed to make my position seem unreasonable and my children's behavior seem justified and necessary. But what devastated me almost more than the content of the article was its existence at all. For this story to have been written with such detail and inside knowledge of our family situation, someone had to have provided extensive information to the journalist. Someone had to have shared private family conversations, legal disputes, and confidential details about my finances and living situation. Someone had to have actively sought out media attention specifically to humiliate me and undermine my position. I called Margaret immediately. "This is defamation," she said after I read her key portions of the article over the phone. "It's also potentially a violation of privacy, depending on how the information was obtained and whether any confidential communications were disclosed. Can we do something about it?" "Absolutely. We can demand a retraction, file a defamation lawsuit, and pursue harassment charges if we can prove this was part of a coordinated campaign to damage your reputation. But first, we need to establish exactly who provided the information to this journalist and what their motivations were." The investigation didn't take long. Sandra Mitchell, it turned out, was a freelance journalist who specialized in stories about family dysfunction and social problems. She had been contacted by someone claiming to be concerned about an elderly neighbor who was showing signs of mental instability and financial irresponsibility. The tip had come with detailed information about my legal and financial situation, including specifics that only my children would have known. But the real surprise came when Margaret's investigator dug deeper into the journalist's background and discovered something that changed everything about the story. Sandra Mitchell wasn't just a freelance writer. She was also Meredith's college roommate. The article wasn't objective journalism, Margaret explained when she called with the results of her investigation. It was a coordinated character assassination, designed to create public pressure for you to accept your children's plans for your property and finances. This rises to the level of harassment and possibly conspiracy to commit fraud. I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the ocean view that my children wanted to turn into cash, trying to process the sheer calculation behind what they had done. This wasn't just family drama or even ordinary greed. This was a carefully planned campaign to destroy my reputation and credibility so thoroughly that no one would question their right to override my decisions about my own life. They had weaponized our family conflict, turning it into a public relations battle designed to portray me as incompetent and them as long-suffering children trying to protect a mother who had lost the ability to make rational decisions. But as I processed the betrayal, I felt that now familiar steel rising in my chest. They had escalated the situation far beyond family disagreement into something that resembled psychological warfare. They had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, violated trust that couldn't be repaired. And after everything I had been through, the broken promises, the financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation, the public humiliation, I wasn't hurt anymore. I was angry. Not the helpless, frustrated anger of someone being victimized, but the focused, determined anger of someone who had finally decided to fight back. "What are our options?" I asked Margaret. "Well, we can pursue this through the courts, of course. Defamation, invasion of privacy, harassment, conspiracy, there are multiple potential charges. But litigation is expensive, time-consuming, and public. It would mean more media attention, more detailed discussion of your private family matters, more opportunities for your children to spread their narrative." She paused. "Or we could pursue a different strategy. Something more creative." "What do you mean?" "What if, instead of just defending against their attacks, we created our own narrative? What if we gave them something to really worry about?" Margaret explained her idea, and by the time she finished, I was smiling for the first time in weeks. It was a risky plan, one that could backfire spectacularly. But it would also give me the chance to take control of the situation instead of just reacting to my children's increasingly desperate attempts to force me into submission. "Let's do it," I said. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to counter their narrative about my mental instability and poor decision-making, we would lean into it. We would create a situation where their worst fears appeared to be coming true, where it looked like their delay in gaining control over my assets was going to cost them everything they thought they were entitled to. Margaret arranged for a very public meeting with representatives from several charitable organizations that focused on ocean conservation, historic preservation, and elder care advocacy. The meeting was held at the beach house itself, with photographers and local press invited to document my apparent intention to donate the property to charity rather than leaving it to my children. I played my part perfectly, discussing my desire to create a lasting legacy that would benefit the community rather than enriching ungrateful heirs who had shown no appreciation for the family property. I spoke movingly about the importance of preserving coastal ecosystems and providing resources for elderly people who, like me, had been abandoned by their families in their time of greatest need. The representatives from the charities were genuine. Of course, Margaret had contacted organizations that would actually be thrilled to receive such a significant donation. But they were also coached to emphasize the permanence of the decision and the tax advantages of making the gift during my lifetime rather than through my estate. The local newspaper covered the event extensively, with photographs of me showing the charity representatives around the property and quotes from organizational leaders about the significance of my intended gift. The article portrayed me as a generous, forward-thinking woman who was using her resources to benefit society rather than perpetuating family wealth. But the most important paragraph was buried near the end of the article. Mrs. Coleman indicated that the donation process should be completed within the next few months, before the end of the tax year. Within hours of the article being published online, my phone started ringing. First Meredith, then Ethan, then both of them together in a conference call that devolved into near hysteria as they realized that their delays and legal maneuvering might have cost them the inheritance they had been counting on. "Mom, you can't just give away our inheritance," Meredith screamed into the phone. "That house belongs to our family." "It belongs to me," I said calmly. "And I can do whatever I want with it. But we're your children. You can't just cut us out of your will because we had a disagreement about timing." "This isn't about timing," I replied. "It's about respect. And you've made it very clear how you feel about me and my right to make my own decisions." Ethan jumped in, his voice taking on the pleading tone I had never heard from him before. "Mom, please, let's talk about this. We can work something out. We never meant to hurt your feelings. We were just trying to help." "Help?" I laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "By going to the media to have me declared mentally incompetent? By having your college roommate write articles about how I'm a crazy old woman who needs to be protected from my own poor judgment?" The silence that followed told me they knew I had discovered their role in the newspaper article. We never meant for it to go that far," Meredith said, her voice small and defeated. "Sandra said she was just doing a general piece about elder issues. We didn't know she was going to make it so specific. You gave a journalist detailed information about my private financial and legal affairs in order to publicly humiliate me and undermine my credibility," I said. "If that's not exactly what you meant to do, then you're either lying to me or lying to yourselves." Over the next few days, they called repeatedly, each conversation more desperate than the last. They offered apologies that might have been sincere, explanations that sounded increasingly hollow, and promises of future good behavior that I no longer believed. They suggested family therapy, legal mediation, and any number of solutions that would preserve their access to my assets while requiring minimal changes in their behavior toward me. But I had moved beyond the point where apologies and promises could repair the relationship. Too much trust had been broken, too many lines had been crossed, too many years of accumulated resentment and exploitation had built up between us. I no longer believed that they loved me in any meaningful sense of the word, and I no longer cared whether they did. What I cared about was reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my right to make my own choices about my own future. The charity donation, of course, was never real. Margaret had structured the meetings and press coverage to create the appearance of an imminent gift without any actual legal commitment on my part. The documents I had appeared to be reviewing were preliminary materials, not binding agreements, and the timeline for completion was deliberately vague enough to leave me plenty of room to change my mind. But my children didn't know that, and their panic over the potential loss of their inheritance revealed something important. They had never actually cared about my well-being or my happiness. They had cared about my assets, and now that those assets appeared to be slipping away from them, they were finally showing me the attention and respect they should have been showing all along. It was too little, too late. A month after the charity meeting, I invited Carla over for dinner to celebrate what felt like the end of a long and exhausting war. We cooked together in the kitchen of the beach house, preparing a meal that we would eat at leisure without worrying about accommodating anyone else's dietary restrictions or schedule conflicts. "Do you ever regret it?" Carla asked as we sat on the deck watching another spectacular sunset. "Standing up to them the way you did?" I considered the question seriously. My relationship with my children was probably damaged beyond repair. I would likely never have grandchildren to spoil or family holidays to host. I had traded the illusion of family closeness for the reality of family honesty, and the trade-off was sometimes painful. No, I said finally. I regret that it took me so long to do it. I regret allowing myself to be treated badly for so many years because I was afraid of conflict. I regret teaching them that my love was unconditional but my resources were unlimited. I sipped my wine and watched the waves roll onto the beach. But I don't regret choosing self-respect over family harmony. I don't regret insisting that they treat me like a person instead of a convenient resource. And I don't regret keeping this house, even if it means spending holidays alone. You won't be alone, Carla said gently. You have friends. You have a community. You have people who care about you for who you are, not what you can give them. She was right. Over the past few months, as I had stopped devoting all my emotional energy to managing my relationship with my children, I had rediscovered other relationships and interests that had been neglected for years. I had reconnected with old friends from my physical therapy career, joined a book club at the local library, and started volunteering at a literacy program in Southampton. I had also started taking art classes, something I had always wanted to do but had never found time for when my schedule was dominated by my children's needs and crises. My watercolor paintings of ocean scenes weren't going to win any awards, but working with colors and light gave me a sense of creative satisfaction I hadn't experienced in decades. Most importantly, I had discovered that I actually enjoyed my own company. The solitude that had once felt like punishment now felt like freedom. I could read entire books without interruption, cook meals based solely on my own preferences, and make plans without having to consider other people's convenience or approval. But the peace didn't last. Just when I thought the drama with my children was finally over, I received a call from Margaret that changed everything once again. I have some interesting news, she said. Remember the charity donation story we planted in the newspaper? Of course. Well, it seems your children took it more seriously than we expected. They've retained their own attorney, and they're preparing to file for guardianship over your affairs. My blood ran cold. Can they do that? They can try. And given the public narrative they've created about your mental instability and poor judgment, they might actually succeed if we're not prepared to fight back aggressively. A guardianship proceeding would be the ultimate humiliation, a legal determination that I was incompetent to manage my own affairs, giving my children or a court-appointed guardian complete control over my finances and major life decisions. It would validate everything they had been saying about me, and it would accomplish their original goal of gaining access to my assets while providing legal justification for overriding my wishes. What do we do? I asked. We go on the offensive, Margaret said. We use everything we've documented about their behavior, the unauthorized contact with real estate agents, the financial exploitation, the media manipulation, the harassment, to show the court exactly why they're pursuing guardianship. This isn't about protecting you from your own poor judgment. It's about gaining control over your assets because their previous attempts at manipulation have failed. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for early December, giving us several weeks to prepare our defense. Margaret arranged for comprehensive medical and psychiatric evaluations to establish my mental competency officially. She also collected evidence of my independent living capabilities, bank records showing responsible financial management, testimony from neighbors and friends about my active community involvement, documentation of my volunteer work and creative pursuits. But our strongest evidence was the pattern of exploitation and manipulation my children had engaged in over the past year. The unauthorized real estate contacts, the social media humiliation campaign, the planted newspaper articles, the attempts to monitor my finances without my knowledge, all of it painted a picture of people who were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to gain access to assets that didn't belong to them. The hearing itself was surreal. I sat in a sterile courtroom, surrounded by lawyers and court officers, while my own children argued that I was too mentally unstable to be trusted with my own life. They presented medical records from decades ago, testimony from distant relatives who had no recent contact with me, and the newspaper articles their friend had written based on information they had provided. Their attorney painted a picture of a confused, isolated elderly woman making increasingly erratic decisions about her finances and living situation. He emphasized the value of the beach house and my apparent inability to maintain it properly, suggested that my refusal to sell it was evidence of impaired judgment, and argued that my hostility toward family members who were trying to help was a symptom of paranoid thinking. But Margaret was ready for all of it. She had the court reporter read back portions of the depositions where Meredith and Ethan had been forced to admit their financial motivations and their unauthorized activities regarding the property. She presented evidence of their media manipulation campaign, including the connection between the journalist and Meredith. She showed the court social media posts and communications that revealed their true attitudes toward me and their real reasons for seeking control over my affairs. Most importantly, she had Dr. Patricia Williams, the geriatric psychiatrist who had evaluated me, testify about her findings. Dr. Williams explained that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment, that my decision-making abilities were completely intact, and that my distrust of my children was a rational response to their documented pattern of exploitation and manipulation. In my professional opinion, Dr. Williams testified, Mrs. Coleman's judgment about her family dynamics is not only sound but remarkably clear-sighted. Her decision to protect her assets from people who have repeatedly demonstrated that they value her resources more than her well-being is not evidence of mental illness, it's evidence of mental health. The judge, a woman in her 50s who had probably seen similar family dynamics in multiple cases, was not impressed with my children's petition. She denied the guardianship request and ordered them to pay my legal fees, noting in her ruling that the proceeding appeared to be motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern for my welfare. The evidence suggests, she wrote in her formal ruling, that the petitioners have engaged in a systematic campaign to undermine the respondent's reputation and credibility in order to gain access to assets that legally belong to her. This court will not be used as a tool to facilitate what appears to be elder abuse disguised as family concern. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a sense of vindication and closure that I hadn't expected. Not only had I won, but I had won so decisively that my children's motivations and behavior had been officially recognized as exploitative and inappropriate. The legal system, which I had been afraid might side with younger, more articulate family members against an elderly woman living alone, had instead validated my position completely. But more than the legal victory, I felt the deep satisfaction of having refused to be broken by people who had tried to reduce me to nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their financial goals. I had stood up to intimidation, manipulation, character assassination, and legal threats, and I had not only survived but prevailed. On the drive home from court, Margaret asked me what I wanted to do next. Live my life, I said simply. I want to live my life without having to justify my choices or apologize for taking up space or worry about whether my decisions are going to inconvenience someone else. I want to enjoy this house that I worked so hard to buy and maintain, and I want to stop letting other people's opinions about my choices affect my peace of mind. And your children? Do you think there's any possibility of reconciliation? I watched the familiar scenery of eastern Long Island roll past the car window, the potato fields and horse farms, the small towns and summer communities that had become so much a part of my identity over the years. These were the places where I had chosen to build my life, and I was proud of that choice even if my children couldn't understand or appreciate it. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe someday, if they can learn to genuinely respect my autonomy and my right to make my own decisions. But they would have to acknowledge the damage they've done, and they would have to demonstrate real change in how they treat me, not just apologize and then go back to the same patterns. That's a very mature position, Margaret said. A lot of people in your situation would either cut off contact completely or accept reconciliation on any terms just to have the relationship back. I'm too old to waste time on relationships that require me to diminish myself, I said. If they want to be part of my life going forward, they need to accept me as I am, a competent adult who has the right to make her own choices, even if they don't understand or approve of those choices. The first Christmas after the court case was the hardest. I had always hosted elaborate holiday celebrations at the beach house, spending weeks preparing meals and decorating rooms and creating the perfect backdrop for family memories. The thought of spending Christmas alone in that big house, surrounded by all the evidence of happier family times, was almost unbearable. But Carla had a different idea. What if we did something completely different, she suggested. Something that has nothing to do with traditional family obligations or the way you used to celebrate. Something just for us. We ended up spending Christmas week in Key West, staying in a small bed and breakfast near the water and exploring art galleries and restaurants and sunset celebrations that had nothing to do with family traditions or holiday expectations. It was warm and relaxed and wonderfully free of the emotional baggage that had come to surround every family gathering. On Christmas evening, as we sat on a restaurant deck watching the sun set over the Gulf of Mexico, I realized that I was happier than I had been during any family holiday in recent memory. There was no underlying tension about gift expenditures or meal preparations or managing everyone else's expectations and disappointments. There was just the simple pleasure of good food, beautiful scenery, and easy companionship with someone who valued my company without expecting anything else from me. This is nice, I said, raising my glass of wine in a toast to our unconventional holiday celebration. To new traditions, Carla replied, clinking her glass against mine. And to the courage to create the life you actually want instead of the life other people expect you to have. When we returned home after New Year's, I found a letter in my mailbox from Meredith. It was the first direct communication I had received from either of my children since the court hearing, and I wasn't sure I was ready to deal with whatever it contained. The letter was handwritten on expensive stationery, and it was longer than any personal communication I had received from Meredith in years. She wrote about her regret over the way our relationship had deteriorated, her sadness about the legal battles, and her hope that we could find a way to rebuild some kind of connection. But as I read more carefully, I realized that the letter was still fundamentally about her needs rather than mine. She was sorry that our conflict had caused her stress and public embarrassment. She was sad that our family had been torn apart by misunderstandings and legal complications. She hoped we could move past the unfortunate events of the past year and return to a more normal family relationship. There was no acknowledgement that her actions had been wrong, no recognition of the financial and emotional exploitation I had experienced, no indication that she understood why I had felt the need to protect myself from her behavior. The letter was an apology for consequences, not for actions. I wrote back, but my response was much shorter than hers had been. Dear Meredith, I appreciate you taking the time to write, and I'm glad to know that you regret the way our relationship has evolved. If you're genuinely interested in rebuilding a connection between us, I would be willing to meet for lunch somewhere neutral to discuss what that might look like. But any future relationship would need to be based on mutual respect and acceptance of boundaries, not on the kind of financial and emotional dynamics we've had in the past. I hope you're doing well, and I wish you happiness in whatever form of life you choose to build. With love, Mom. She never responded to that letter, and I never sent another one. I realized that she had been hoping for an easy reconciliation that would restore her access to my resources without requiring her to acknowledge or change the behavior that had made protection necessary in the first place. As the seasons passed and I settled into my new life as a truly independent person, I sometimes thought about the family I had imagined when my children were small. I had pictured holiday celebrations that would continue for decades, grandchildren who would play in the same rooms where their parents had grown up, a legacy of love and connection that would outlast my own lifetime. That vision hadn't materialized, and there was grief in accepting that reality. But there was also relief in no longer trying to force relationships that had become painful and exploitative. I had traded the illusion of family closeness for the reality of personal peace, and most days, I was satisfied with that exchange. I kept the beach house, of course. It was my sanctuary, my achievement, my proof that I had built something beautiful and lasting with my own hands and resources. But more than that, it was the place where I had finally learned to value my own comfort and happiness as much as I had once valued other people's approval. I still missed my children sometimes. I missed the people I had thought they were, the relationship I had believed we shared, the future I had imagined we would build together. But I didn't miss the anxiety of constantly managing their reactions, the exhaustion of pouring myself into relationships that only flowed in one direction, or the humiliation of being valued primarily for what I could provide rather than for who I was. On quiet evenings, I would sit on my deck watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, and I would think about the woman I had been when this all started, afraid of conflict, desperate for approval, willing to sacrifice her own needs to maintain the illusion of family harmony. She seemed like a stranger to me now, someone I could feel compassion for but could no longer understand. The woman I had become was harder in some ways, less yielding and accommodating. But she was also more honest, more authentic, more committed to living according to her own values rather than other people's expectations. She had learned that love without respect was not really love at all, and that giving without boundaries was not generosity but enabling. She had learned, perhaps most importantly, that being alone was not the worst thing that could happen to a person. Being diminished, exploited, and disrespected by people you loved, that was worse than solitude. Being forced to apologize for existing, to minimize your needs to accommodate other people's comfort, to accept crumbs of attention and call it love, that was worse than independence. As I write this story, sharing it with you from the deck of the house I fought so hard to keep, I can see the morning sun rising over the Atlantic Ocean, painting the waves in shades of gold and pink that never cease to take my breath away. The air is crisp with the promise of autumn, and I can hear the sound of birds calling to each other as they prepare for their seasonal migrations. This house, this view, this peaceful morning routine, it all could have been lost if I had allowed my children to convince me that their financial needs were more important than my right to make my own choices about my own life. The woman I was a year ago might have given in, might have signed the papers and moved to some small apartment where I would have spent my remaining years regretting the surrender of everything I had worked to build. But I'm not that woman anymore. I'm someone who has learned that protecting your peace sometimes requires disappointing people who expect you to sacrifice yourself for their convenience. I'm someone who understands that family relationships, like all relationships, require mutual respect to be healthy and sustainable. I'm someone who finally knows the difference between being loved and being needed, between being valued and being used. My story might sound familiar to some of you listening. Maybe you've found yourself in similar situations, caught between your desire to help family members and your need to protect your own well-being. Maybe you've struggled with the question of how much you should sacrifice for people you love, even when that love doesn't seem to be reciprocated in meaningful ways. Maybe you've wondered whether standing up for yourself makes you selfish, whether setting boundaries makes you unloving, whether choosing your own happiness over other people's convenience makes you a bad person. If any of this resonates with your own experience, I want you to know that you're not alone, and you're not wrong to want respect along with affection, consideration along with care. You're not asking too much when you expect the people who claim to love you to treat you with basic courtesy and honesty. You deserve relationships that nourish you rather than drain you, that build you up rather than diminish you, that honor your autonomy rather than exploit your generosity. The journey to those healthier relationships might require difficult conversations, uncomfortable boundaries, and painful confrontations with people you would rather keep happy. It might mean disappointing people whose approval you've spent years trying to earn. It might mean accepting that some relationships cannot be saved, no matter how much history or blood or hope you've invested in them. But the alternative, living your life according to other people's expectations, sacrificing your own needs and desires to maintain relationships that only work when you make yourself smaller, that's not really living at all. It's existing in service to other people's comfort, and you deserve so much more than that. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family love came with conditions that required you to diminish yourself? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our stories helps us understand that we're not alone in these struggles, and that there's wisdom and strength in the community of people who have faced similar challenges. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own worth and your right to be treated with dignity, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. Let's keep opening our hearts to each other, sharing our truths, and supporting each other in the ongoing work of building lives that honor who we really are rather than who other people expect us to be. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you deserve love that comes without conditions, respect that doesn't have to be earned through sacrifice, and relationships that celebrate your worth rather than exploit it. You deserve to live your own life, in your own house, making your own choices, surrounded by people who love you for exactly who you are.